The morning of my wedding smelled like pine resin and cold stone. I remember that detail more than anything else. More than the white linen dress hanging from the iron hook near the window. More than the sound of the other women moving through the hallways of Stonehaven Keep with armfuls of winter flowers. The pine smell came from the great torches lit along the corridor outside my chamber door, and it wrapped around me like a warning I couldn't quite translate. I stood at the narrow window with my arms crossed over my chest, looking out at the mountains. Frost had crept across the glass overnight, leaving feathered patterns at the edges, and through the clear center, I could see the gray valley stretching wide and silent below the keep. My blonde hair was already braided, long and pale as winter wheat, pinned carefully at the base of my neck by Sarah, who had hummed quietly while she worked and said nothing about the way my hands wouldn't stop trembling. She noticed. Sarah always noticed everything. "You're cold," she said, which was her way of asking whether I was all right without actually asking. "I'm fine," I told her, which was my way of lying without technically lying. "My name is Mabel. I am 24 years old. In 3 hours, I was supposed to walk into the great hall of Stonehaven Keep and marry Lord Calder Voss, a man chosen by the Pack Council, a man with standing and territory, and a calm, deliberate smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was not unkind. He had never raised his voice at me. He had offered me security in a world where security was the rarest luxury an Omega woman could possess. I told myself, every morning for the past 6 weeks, that this was enough. I almost believed it. The keep had been alive since before dawn. I could hear the footsteps through the stone floors, the distant clang of the kitchens, the low murmur of voices belonging to the council members who had traveled from 3 different territories to witness this union. A wedding between an Omega with no pack standing and a high-ranking Beta Lord was unusual enough to draw attention. The council approved of it precisely because it was tidy. No power imbalance, no complications, no history. No history. That was the part they had built the whole arrangement around, actually. The part that made Calder Voss the correct, logical, sensible choice. Because the one who had history with me was gone. Aiden Reese had left Stonehaven territory 7 years ago. He had been 18, broad-shouldered and restless, with dark braided hair and eyes the color of winter sky just before snow. A young man burning with something none of us had words for yet. We had grown up in the same lower district. We had climbed the same walls, learned our letters from the same crumbling school books, spent long summers trailing through the pine forests, arguing about everything and nothing. He had been my closest companion for 4 years, from the time I was 13 until the morning I was 17, and he simply wasn't there anymore. No letter, no warning, no explanation that made sense. His mother told the district he had gone to pursue training in the Northern Territories. The council said something vague about a placement program for promising young wolves. Neither explanation filled the shape of the absence he left behind, which was specific and jagged, and did not soften with time the way people always promised it would. I learned, eventually, to carry it quietly. That was what Omega women were trained to do, after all. Carry things quietly, take up the smallest possible amount of space, be grateful for what stability they could find. I had done exactly that. I had worked in the Keep's records hall for 3 years, cataloging pack histories and correspondence, building a reputation for careful attention and discretion. I had accepted Calder Voss's offer of alliance when the council presented it, because it was reasonable, and I was 24, and the pine and frost winters of Stonehaven were very long to spend entirely alone. "Mabel." Sarah's voice came from behind me. "They're asking if you want to come down for the pre-ceremony gathering." I turned from the window. She was watching me with those careful dark eyes of hers. Sarah, who had been my friend since we were both 12, who knew about Aiden, and had never once mentioned his name unprompted in 7 years. "Give me a moment," I said. She nodded and slipped out, closing the heavy door behind her. I looked back at the mountains, The thing I have never told anyone. Not Sarah. Not the council's appointed ceremony guide. Not even myself in the clearest moments of honesty. Is that I had dreamed about Aiden Reese 3 nights before my wedding was announced. Not a vague dream. Not the blurred kind that dissolves when the light hits it. A clear, sharp dream in which he stood at the edge of the pine forest below the keep with snow falling around him, looking up at my window, and said nothing at all. Just looked. I had woken up with my heart beating too fast, and the smell of pine so strong I thought for a moment the forest had come inside. I told myself it meant nothing. Old wounds surface under pressure. It was only the stress of the upcoming ceremony. I smoothed the front of my gray cloak, the one I wore every day, plain and practical, and turned toward the door. That was when I heard it. Not words at first. Just sound, a shift in the quality of the noise traveling through the stone walls. The distant hum of the gathering hall below suddenly changed. It didn't get louder exactly. It got different. Hushed in the way that crowds go hushed when something unexpected appears, when the social calculation of a room rewrites itself in a single instant. Then I heard one word, spoken by someone in the corridor just outside my chamber. A guard, from the sound of the boots. One word. King. And then a second voice, lower, closer to the door. The AlphaKing is at the gate. The cold that moved through me then had nothing to do with the frost on the window. I stood completely still for 3 full seconds. Then I crossed the room and pressed my ear to the door without thinking, forgetting that I was a woman in a white dress on her wedding morning, forgetting everything except that single word, and the way it landed in my chest like a stone dropped into very deep water. The guards' voices continued. He came alone. Well, with 4 of his men. No advance notice. The council is... I know what the council is. Where is he now? Main gate. He's not asking permission to enter. A pause. He never does. I pulled back from the door. Outside the window I heard it then. Horses. The particular sound of a group arriving with authority, not speed. Deliberate. Unhurried. The kind of arrival that says, I am not here because I was invited. I am here because I chose to come. My hands were flat against the door's wood, and they were perfectly, completely still for the first time all morning. The AlphaKing. Aiden. The boy who left without a word was coming through the gates of Stonehaven. Keep on the morning of my wedding, and somewhere beneath 7 years of careful quiet. Something in me already knew. Had perhaps always known, the way the body knows a storm before the sky shows any sign, that nothing about this day was going to go the way the council had planned. I straightened, picked up my gray cloak from the chair, and waited. The keep erupted the way old stone buildings do when something unexpected moves through them. Not with noise exactly, but with vibration. I could feel it through the soles of my feet as I stood at the center of my chamber, cloak fastened, braid tight, breathing the way Sarah had once taught me to breathe when panic tried to climb into my throat and take up residence there. In through the nose. Count 4. Out through the mouth. Count 4. It didn't work as well as it used to. Voices carried up the stairwell in fragments. The council members assembling in the lower corridor, their tones clipped and urgent in the particular way of men who consider themselves important and have just been reminded that importance is relative. I caught words here and there. Protocol. Unannounced. Jurisdiction. And beneath those words, threaded through like a darker current, why today? Why today? I wanted to laugh. I pressed my knuckles against my mouth instead and focused on the window, on the gray sky, on the ordinary permanence of the mountains. Sarah came back 7 minutes later. I counted. She opened the door without knocking, which told me everything, because Sarah always knocked, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not quite fear, something more complicated than fear. The face of someone who has been carrying a piece of information for a long time and has just watched it become impossible to carry anymore. "He's inside," she said. "I know." "Mabel, is he asking for me?" She hesitated. That half-second told me more than her words did. "He's asking for the council," she said carefully. "But he named you. In the gate declaration. He named you by name." The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. "What did he say?" My voice came out steadier than I deserved. Sarah looked at the floor, then back at me. "He said he had a territorial claim to present before any alliance ceremony could proceed. And then he said, 'Mabel,' he said her name is Mabel, and this ceremony does not happen today." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard in years. I turned back to the window. Below, in the stone courtyard that I could just barely see at an angle through the frosted glass, there were figures moving. The council's ceremonial guards in their dark coats, and among them, cutting through the formation, the way a stone cuts through water. A tall figure in black and fur, braided dark hair, moving with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who has never once in his life been required to ask for space, because space was always made. 7 years. He was broader than I remembered. The boy I had known had been tall, but unfinished somehow. All restless energy and sharp edges that didn't quite fit together. This man below moved like the edges had found their arrangement. Like something had happened to him in those 7 years that the body recorded permanently. I didn't let myself stare. I stepped back from the window. "Where is Calder?" I asked. "In the antechamber with his second. He's been told there's a procedural delay." Sarah paused. "He doesn't know who yet. He'll know soon." "Yes." Another pause. "How are you feeling?" That was such a Sarah question, practical and genuine and slightly impossible to answer, that I almost smiled despite myself. "I feel like the pine forest came inside," I said, which made no sense to her and perfect sense to me. She crossed the room and stood beside me. Not touching. Just present, the way Sarah had always been present. Solid and quiet and entirely reliable. We stood there together for a moment, listening to the keep reorganize itself around something none of us had prepared for. "You don't have to go down," she said. "I know. But you're going to." "Yes." She straightened my cloak collar with a brisk, matter-of-fact gesture. "Then walk like you belong there," she said. "Because you do." The great hall of Stonehaven Keep smelled like beeswax and winter flowers, and underneath both of those, the metallic edge of tension that a room full of high-ranking wolves generates when something has disrupted the expected order of things. I came down the main staircase. I want to be honest about this. I had imagined this moment approximately 10,000 times in the space of the 30 minutes it took me to descend those stairs. I had imagined it with fury, with tears, with a cold and practiced dignity that would make clear I had built a life in his absence and would not be undone by his presence. I had prepared an entire architecture of composure. What I had not prepared for was the way he turned the moment I reached the 3rd step from the bottom. Not because someone told him I was there, not because there was any particular sound. He simply turned, as if the air in the room had changed composition, and he had noticed it. I stopped on the 3rd step. He looked at me. 7 years collapsed. Not gently. Not in any of the soft cinematic ways that stories describe reunion. It collapsed the way a structure collapses when the thing holding it up is suddenly removed, all at once, and with a sound that only I could hear. Aidan Reese was 25 years old, and he was the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, which meant that 4 territories and approximately 30,000 wolves answered to him, which meant that the council members currently arranged around him like uneasy satellites were doing the specific calculations of men who hold local power in the presence of absolute power and don't enjoy the arithmetic. He was looking at me with those winter sky eyes, and absolutely nothing on his face that I could read, which had always been his way. Not coldness exactly, but a kind of stillness that other people misread as coldness, and that I had once, a long time ago, known how to look past. I didn't know if I still knew how. Mabel. He said my name the way you say a word you have been holding in your mouth for a long time without speaking. Not loudly. The room was quiet enough that it carried anyway. Your Majesty, I said. Something moved across his face at that, brief and controlled. But there. Councillor Fenn, gray-haired, hawk-faced, the senior member of Stonehaven's ruling body, stepped forward from his position at Aiden's left. Miss Mabel, perhaps you should return to your chamber while we resolve this procedural matter. She stays. Aiden's voice hadn't changed in volume. It didn't need to. Councillor Fenn's mouth closed. I descended the final 3 steps and came to stand on the hall floor, which put me at ground level with everyone else and gave me no particular advantage, which was generally the Omega's position in any room, present but not elevated, visible but not centered. I was accustomed to it. You declared a territorial claim at the gate, I said, addressing Aiden directly, because if we were doing this, then we were going to do it plainly. The council will want to examine its basis. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest recalibration, as if he had expected something other than this from me, as if the version of me he had been carrying in his memory for 7 years was different from the woman standing in front of him. Good, I thought. Let him recalibrate. The claim stands, he said, and it will be presented formally. His gaze didn't move from my face. But first I need 2 minutes. 2 minutes for what? Councillor Fenn interjected. 2 minutes with Mabel. He paused, the word quiet and deliberate. Alone. The hall went very still. I looked at him. Really looked. Past the fur and leather and the intimidating breadth of him. Past the 7 years and everything they represented. And I thought about the pine smell that had followed me through my dreams for 3 nights, and the way my hands had trembled all morning until the moment I heard the word king spoken in the corridor. 2 minutes, I said, and I walked toward the side corridor without waiting to see if anyone objected. The side corridor off the great hall was narrow and cold, lit by 2 wall torches that threw uneven amber light across the stone. It smelled like old wood and candle smoke and, faintly, like the pine resin from the courtyard torches that had been following me all morning like a question I hadn't answered yet. I stopped at the corridor's midpoint and turned around. Aiden stepped in behind me and pulled the heavy curtain across the entrance. Not a door, just thick wool. But it was enough. The sounds of the hall dropped away to a muffled murmur. We were alone for the first time in 7 years, and the space between us was approximately 4 feet of cold stone air, and I had no idea what to do with my hands. I clasped them in front of me. 2 minutes, I said. You asked for 2 minutes. He stood with his back to the curtain, arms at his sides, watching me with that unreadable stillness. Up close, the changes 7 years had made were more visible. A scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before, thin and pale. Lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't existed when he was 18. He looked like someone who had made a very large number of decisions and carried every one of them. You look, he started. Don't, I said quietly, not harshly, just clearly. He stopped. Say what you came to say, I told him. The council is waiting. Calder is waiting. The entire keep is waiting. So say it. A long pause. The torches crackled. I left because they made me leave, he said. The words landed flat and simple, the way true things often do, without decoration, without the softening architecture of excuse. I kept my expression neutral. I had known, in some part of myself, that there would be an explanation. There is always an explanation. That doesn't mean the explanation fills the shape of what was missing. The Northern Council identified me at 18, he continued. They came to Stonehaven quietly, told my mother there was a placement, which was technically true, the way a door slamming shut is technically movement. They gave me 6 hours to decide. If I stayed and refused the position, they would have taken it by other means, the kind of means that would have affected the lower district, affected the people who lived there. He paused. Affected you, I breathed. You couldn't send a letter, I said. I was watched for 3 years. Every communication audited. By the time I had enough authority to act without oversight. He stopped. There is no version of this that sounds like enough, Mabel. I know that. I'm not here to ask you to accept an explanation. Then what are you here for? The question came out smaller than I intended, more honest than I wanted. He looked at me with those winter sky eyes that the frost on my window had been trying to imitate all morning, and he said, I'm here because you are about to marry a man the council selected for you, and I know that system. I have sat across the table from the architects of that system for 7 years, and I know that when the council arranges an Omega's alliance, they are arranging an asset, not a future, and you deserve better than to be arranged. The torches crackled again. Calder Voss is not unkind, I said. I know. He has offered me stability. I know that too. Then you understand that stability is not a small thing. My voice was steady. I was proud of it. You understand that 7 years of building something quiet and functional from what was left. You understand that is not nothing. That is not something a person walks away from because someone rides through the gate at the last hour. I do understand that. He took 1 step forward, not closing the distance entirely, just reducing it. That's why I'm asking you to hear the claim before you decide, not telling you, asking. I studied his face. What is the claim? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. 7 years ago, he said, before I left Stonehaven, I registered a prior bond declaration with the Northern Council's records office. It was the one act of administration they allowed me in those first months, and I used it for this. A prior declaration cannot be overridden by a council-arranged alliance ceremony. It requires the declared party's explicit rejection before any other ceremony can proceed. The corridor felt very small. You declared a bond. My voice came out careful and measured, the voice I used in the records hall when I was processing information I needed to understand completely before I reacted to it. 7 years ago, without telling me. Yes, that is... I stopped. Started again. That is a significant piece of information to have kept from someone for 7 years, Aiden. Yes, he said again. No deflection, no softening, just the word, and the scar on his jaw, and the particular expression of a person who has decided that honesty is the only currency left available to them. I turned away from him and looked at the stone wall. There was a crack running through the mortar between 2 blocks, thin and crooked, traveling upward about a foot before it disappeared. I focused on it. Here is what I knew about myself, standing in that corridor. I knew that I was not the girl who had spent years quietly mourning an absence. That girl had existed, and she had eventually, patiently, built something over the crater that absence had left. Not a perfect structure, but a functional one. Records work, Sarah's friendship, the small, reliable pleasures of knowing her place in a complicated world. I also knew, and this was the part that I had been arguing with since the moment I heard the word king in the corridor above, that I had never once, in 6 weeks of wedding preparation, dreamed about Calder Voss. I had dreamed about pine forests. I turned back. If I reject the declaration, I said, The ceremony proceeds. Yes. And if I don't reject it, if I ask the council to honor it, what does that mean, practically? For me. Not for territories or alliances or political arrangements. For me. He held my gaze. It means you come to Thornwall Keep as a guest of the crown. No obligations, no arrangements. You would have your own quarters, your own autonomy, access to the Royal Records Archive, which I understand from your reputation you would find considerable. A pause. And it means we have time to talk, to say the things that 7 years of silence left unsaid. Nothing is decided beyond that. Nothing is decided beyond that. It was, I realized, the most honest offer anyone had made me in a very long time. Not a promise of perfect happiness. Not a guarantee. Just time, and honesty, and an archive full of records. I almost smiled. You researched my professional reputation, I said. You cataloged 600 years of Stonehaven pack history in 3 years, he said. The Northern Archives have twice that, and no one half as careful. I looked at him for a long moment. I need to speak to Calder, I said finally, before anything is presented to the council. He deserves to hear this from me, not from a procedural declaration read aloud in the Great Hall. Something shifted in Aiden's expression. Relief, or something close to it, though he controlled it quickly. That's fair. And I need Sarah present for the council meeting. Done. And Aiden. I met his eyes. If I decide, after all of this, that I want to go through with the ceremony, you accept that. No further claims, no procedural obstacles. You accept my decision, and you leave. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Yes, he said. I accept that. I nodded once, pulled in a breath of cold corridor air. Then I reached out and pulled the wool curtain back and walked toward the great hall and the waiting council and the wedding morning that had stopped being simple the moment the smell of pine followed me out of a dream and into the waking world. Behind me, I heard Aiden follow, steady, unhurried, like someone who had learned in 7 years of being the most powerful man in 4 territories, that the only thing worth waiting for was worth waiting for properly. Calder Voss was standing at the window of the antechamber when I came in. He was a composed man by nature, angular features, dark hair cut close, always dressed with the precise neatness of someone who considered presentation a form of argument. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and he was looking out at the courtyard below, and I knew from the set of his shoulders that he already knew. Not the details, but the shape of it. Some things announce themselves before they are spoken. I closed the door behind me. Sarah remained in the hallway, as I had asked. This part was mine to do alone. Calder. He turned. His expression was controlled in the way of a man who has decided in advance how he intends to receive difficult news. Not cold, not wounded. Something more deliberate than either of those. The face of someone applying reason to a situation that reason alone cannot entirely process. The Alpha King, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. A pause. He looked at me with those calm, assessing eyes and said nothing for a moment. Is he someone you knew before? Calder said. Or someone you know now? The precision of that question, the way it cut directly to the thing that mattered, reminded me of why the council had considered him an intelligent choice. He was intelligent. He was steady. He had never once been cruel to me. Before, I said. A long time ago. Before I came to the keep. He nodded slowly, processing. And now he is here. He registered a prior bond declaration 7 years ago with the Northern Council. It's a legal instrument. It requires my explicit rejection before a council-arranged alliance can proceed. I kept my voice even, professional, the voice I used in the records hall, I wanted you to hear that from me before it was read aloud downstairs." Calder was quiet for a long moment. He turned back to the window, looked out at the courtyard where I knew Aiden's men were still positioned near the gate, and then turned back to me. "Are you going to reject it?" he asked. I held his gaze. "I don't know yet." The honesty of that seemed to land differently than a prepared answer would have. He studied me for a moment with something that looked almost like respect. "Mabel." He said my name carefully, deliberately. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Not for my benefit, for yours." "All right." "In 6 weeks of preparation," he said, "did you once feel that you were choosing this? Genuinely choosing it, not accepting it as the reasonable available option?" The silence that followed was its own answer. He saw it. I watched him see it, and I watched him absorb what it meant, and I watched him make, quietly, without drama, without the performance of injury, a decision. "The council arranged this alliance," he said. "They presented it to both of us as the sensible conclusion to a calculation, and I accepted that framing because I am, by nature, a person who respects sensible conclusions." He paused. "I think perhaps we are both people who accepted sensible conclusions when we should have asked harder questions." Something loosened in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was tight. "I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it. Not the performative apology of social obligation, but the genuine kind. The kind that acknowledges that a real person had arranged their expectations around a future that was now rearranging itself. "Don't be," he said. Then quieter. "Go hear what he has to say. Make a real choice. That is all any of this was ever supposed to be about." He turned back to the window. I stood there for a moment, looking at his profile, and felt a complicated gratitude that had no clean name. Then I left the antechamber and walked back toward the great hall. The council meeting took place in the formal chamber on the keep's second floor, a round room with high ceilings and a long oak table that had witnessed 7 generations of pack decisions. Councillor Fenn sat at its head. 2 other council members flanked him. Aiden stood on the opposite side of the table with 2 of his men behind him, and Sarah stood near the far wall as I had requested, straight-backed and watchful. I sat in the chair they placed between the 2 parties, which was either an attempt at neutrality or a staging of the obvious, and I kept my hands flat on the table where everyone could see them. Councillor Fenn read the declaration aloud from the document Aiden's second produced. It was a formal, dry piece of legal language, but its meaning was clear enough. A registered prior claim, filed with the Northern Council 7 years ago, signed and sealed and thoroughly legitimate. I watched Fenn's expression move through several phases as he read it. Surprise. Calculation. The specific displeasure of a man who realizes he has been outmaneuvered by paperwork filed before he knew there was a game being played. "This is highly irregular," he said when he finished. "Irregular is not the same as invalid," Aiden said. He hadn't sat down. He stood with his arms crossed, and though his voice was entirely civil, there was something beneath it. Not a threat exactly, but the awareness that he could make things very complicated if he chose to. "The declaration is registered, verified, and current. The law is clear." "And the law requires the declared party's response," Fenn said, turning to me. "Miss Mabel, do you reject this declaration?" Every face in the room turned toward me. I thought about the cold window and the frost patterns and the pine smell that wouldn't leave. I thought about Calder's question. Did you once feel you were genuinely choosing this? And the silence that had answered it. I thought about 7 years of carrying something quietly and calling it healing, when perhaps it had only been patience. "I do not reject it," I said. The room shifted. Councillor Fenn's jaw tightened. "Mabel, I want to be certain you understand what you are." "I understand exactly what I am doing, Counselor." I kept my voice quiet and precise. I am exercising a legal right that exists specifically to protect individuals from alliance arrangements that do not reflect their genuine consent. I am doing what this instrument was designed for, and I would remind the Council that the AlphaKing's jurisdiction supersedes local council authority in matters of registered Northern declarations. A silence. Then Sarah, from her position by the wall, made a sound that she quickly converted into a cough, but that I was fairly certain had started as a laugh. Fen looked at Aiden. Aiden looked at me. And there it was again. That brief, controlled shift in his expression. The recalibration. As if every time I opened my mouth in an official context he was revising something. Good, I thought again. The practical work of unwinding a wedding morning took most of the rest of the day. The winter flowers were quietly removed from the Great Hall. The guests from the outer territories were informed of a procedural delay, with the particular vague diplomacy that council staff had clearly spent centuries perfecting. Caldervoss departed Stonehaven Keep in the late afternoon with his second and 3 council letters of formal apology, and he did it with a dignity that I would not forget. I watched his horses leave from the upper corridor window and said a quiet, sincere goodbye to the version of my future that he had represented. Then I went back to my chamber and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the white linen dress still hanging from the iron hook and felt the full, complicated weight of what the day had been. Sarah appeared at the door 40 minutes later with a tray of food I hadn't asked for and wouldn't have thought to ask for, which was the most Sarah thing she had ever done. She set it on the small table and sat across from me. "So," she said. "So," I said. "Thornwall Keep." She said it the way you say the name of a place on a map that you've looked at many times and never expected to actually visit. That's what he's offered. Time. The archives. My own quarters. I paused. Nothing decided. And you believe him? I thought about it honestly. I believe that he is someone who has spent 7 years learning that authority without integrity collapses eventually. I believe the declaration was real. It was filed when it could have cost him something to file it, which is the only kind of declaration that means anything. I looked at the white dress. I believe that I have been making sensible choices for a very long time, and that sensible choices have given me a functional life, and that functional is not the same as whole. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You're going to go," she said. Not a question. "I think I have to find out," I said. "I think not finding out would be a different kind of loss than the one I've already survived. And I have already survived quite a lot." She looked at me with those careful, dark eyes. Then she picked up a piece of bread from the tray, handed it to me, and said, "Eat something first. You've been standing in cold corridors all day and you haven't eaten since yesterday evening, and you're making major life decisions on an empty stomach, which is something I have opinions about." I took the bread. "Sarah. Will you come with me? To Thornwall?" She looked at me as though I had said something faintly ridiculous. "Obviously," she said. "Did you think I was going to stay here and catalog records alone?" Outside the window, the mountains were turning blue in the early evening light, and somewhere below in the courtyard, I could hear the quiet sounds of Aiden's men making camp for the night. They would stay through the morning, his second had informed the council, and depart when they were ready. When we were ready. I ate the bread and let the day settle around me like sediment, slow and heavy and real. Tomorrow, everything would be different. We left Stonehaven Keep on a gray Thursday morning, 3 days after the wedding. That didn't happen. I want to be precise about that timeline, because people tend to compress it in the retelling. They imagine it as something immediate and dramatic, the AlphaKing arriving and sweeping everything into motion in a single breathless sequence. That is not how it was. There were 3 days of quiet, careful work between the moment I said I do not reject it in the council chamber and the morning I rode out through the keep's main gate with my belongings in 2 traveling trunks and Sarah on a horse beside me. 3 days of settling records, writing formal correspondence to the council that documented my decision in language precise enough that no one could revisit it later. 3 days of walking through the keep's hallways for what I understood were the last times. The records hall where I had spent 3 years of my life among maps and correspondence, and the accumulated paper memory of a pack, the narrow kitchen corridor where Sarah and I had eaten breakfast every morning, the upper window where I had watched 7 winters arrive. I said goodbye to all of it deliberately. Not with grief, exactly. With the specific attention you give to things that have mattered. Aiden gave me those 3 days without pressure. He and his men camped in the outer courtyard, conducting their own business. Correspondence, logistics, whatever it was that the governing of 4 territories required on a daily basis. And he did not come to my chamber, or send messages or attempt to influence the timeline. On the second evening, I passed him in the lower corridor near the library, and we exchanged perhaps 40 words, practical and brief, about the travel route to Thornwall. It was the most honest conversation I had experienced in years. No performance, no navigation of expectations, just 2 people discussing road conditions. I went to sleep that night and did not dream about the pine forest. I dreamed about a library so large I couldn't see the far wall. The road north was 4 days through winter landscape that turned gradually wilder and more dramatic, as Stonehaven's managed farmland gave way to open forest, and then to the rocky upland terrain that the northern reaches were known for. The trees grew taller and darker, the sky sat lower. The air developed a sharpness that was different from Stonehaven's cold, less damp, more mineral, like the cold had come down directly from the stone peaks, rather than traveling across flatlands to reach you. I rode near the middle of the group, which put me behind Aiden's 2 lead riders, and ahead of the supply horses and Sarah, who had immediately formed what appeared to be a functional professional relationship with Aiden's head of logistics, a compact, efficient woman named Greta, who communicated almost entirely in short declarative sentences, and whom Sarah seemed to find deeply admirable. Aiden rode at the front. On the first day, we did not speak beyond practical necessities. On the second day, he dropped back from the lead position in the early afternoon and rode beside me for an hour through a stretch of forest where the pines grew so thick the light came through in columns. He didn't open with anything significant. I noticed it specifically, filed it. He didn't use the time to advance any argument or explain anything further. He asked about the records work. Not in the flattering way of someone performing interest, but in the specific, curious way of someone who actually wanted to understand how the cataloging system worked. So I told him about the organizational method I had developed for cross-referencing territorial correspondence by date and party, rather than subject, which made retrieval significantly faster, about the 300-year-old survey maps I had found misfiled behind a set of trade ledgers and spent 6 weeks properly restoring, about the particular satisfaction of finding the missing piece of a fragmented record and completing the picture it had been trying to make for decades. He listened, asked questions that demonstrated he had actually processed what I said before asking them. When I finished, he said, "The Northern Archive has a section that hasn't been properly organized since my predecessor's time. 40 years of material in rough chronological order, but no cross-reference system, no indexing. His archivist died before completing it, and no one since has had the knowledge to approach it correctly." I looked at him. "That's either a very calculated thing to say to me," I said, "or a genuine problem." "Both," he said simply. I looked back at the road. "Tell me about Thornwall," I said. And he did. He talked about the keep, larger than Stonehaven, built into the face of a northern cliff, so that one entire side of it was solid rock, with a great hall that faced east, and caught the morning light in a way that he said was the one thing about it he had liked immediately upon arrival: the staff, the political structure, the particular difficulties of governing a coalition of 4 territories that had each spent generations developing their own habits of authority and did not naturally defer to central leadership. He talked about it the way someone talks about a responsibility that is genuinely theirs, not with pride exactly, but with the honest, somewhat exhausted ownership of a person who has accepted that a large and complicated thing belongs to them, and they must do right by it. You didn't want it, I said. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't want it the way it was handed to me, he said. I didn't want to be the person who was taken from the lower district of Stonehaven at 18 and installed in a position of authority without consent and told to be grateful for the elevation. A pause. I wanted to be useful. I wanted the work to mean something. Those things I found eventually. The wanting took longer. The forest opened briefly onto a ridge with a wide view of the valley below, gray-green and silver in the winter light, and we both paused for a moment without planning to, looking out at it. I was angry at you for a long time, I said. I want you to know that. Not just sad, angry. Because you were the one person who had ever made the lower district feel like it was enough to be exactly where we were, and then you were gone and you took that feeling with you, and I had to build a replacement for it from scratch. He didn't try to absorb or redirect or qualify that. He just said, I know. You deserve to be angry. I'm sorry. The wind came across the ridge and moved through my braid and carried the smell of snow from somewhere higher up. I'm not angry anymore, I said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling you so you'll feel guilty. I'm telling you because it's true, and because we agreed to say the things that 7 years left unsaid. And what replaced it? He asked. The feeling you had to build from scratch. I thought about it honestly. Competence, I said. Knowing I was good at something. Knowing I could walk into a room full of complicated men with political agendas and remain in possession of my own thinking. It's not the same feeling. But it's real, and it's mine, and I'm not giving it up. He looked at me. I'm not asking you to. I know, I said. That's why I'm telling you. Thornwall Keep appeared on the afternoon of the 4th day as a dark mass against the cliff face, growing larger and more detailed as we descended from the pass. Stone towers, narrow windows that glowed amber from within. A gate wide enough for 8 horses side by side, standing open. I will not pretend it wasn't impressive. It was magnificent in the particular way of things that have been built to endure, rather than to charm. Not decorative, not welcoming in any conventional sense, but absolutely, unmistakably permanent. Sarah pulled her horse up beside me as we descended. Well, she said. Well, I agreed. The archives, she said. I know. You're already thinking about the archives. Sarah, they're 40 years of unindexed material. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that startled a bird from the nearest tree. And I laughed too, there on the road coming down from the northern pass with the keep growing ahead of us, and the winter light going gold across the stone. The months that followed did not resolve themselves into a simple story. I want to be honest about that too, because simple stories are satisfying, but they are not true, and I have spent enough of my life accepting tidiness in place of truth. I worked in the Thornwall archive every morning. That part was immediately, entirely real. The 40 years of unindexed records were exactly as overwhelming and fascinating as Aiden had suggested, and I spent the first month simply mapping the scope of what was there before I began the actual organizational work. Greta assigned me 2 assistants, young women named Poppy and Thea who were sharp and eager and learned the cross-reference system faster than I had learned it myself. Sarah supervised the transition of my Stonehaven files to the Northern Archive with a thoroughness that Greta openly respected, and within 3 weeks the 2 of them had reorganized the entire supply chain documentation for the Eastern Territories, which no one had asked them to do, but which everyone agreed was an improvement. I attended 2 council sessions in my 2nd month at Thornwall, not as a representative, but as the archivist, providing documentation that was relevant to the territorial dispute being discussed. I spoke when the records were relevant. I stayed quiet when they weren't. 3 council members sought me out afterward with specific research requests, which I considered a reasonable beginning. Aiden and I talked, regularly without agenda, the way we had talked when we were young in the lower district, about ideas, about problems, about the things we had read and thought and disagreed about. We walked the cliff path behind the keep on clear evenings when the weather permitted and argued about historical territorial decisions and the gaps in the archive's organizational logic, and occasionally about things that had nothing to do with work at all. The slow burn of trust, rebuilt across months, is not a dramatic thing to witness. It does not have a single moment of resolution. It is mornings of consistent honesty and evenings of comfortable silence and the gradual understanding that a person has learned to exist near you without requiring performance. That is what it was. On a morning in early spring, 4 months after I had walked out of that side corridor and back into the great hall of Stonehaven Keep, Aiden came to the archive and stood at the doorway while I was working. I looked up. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." He came and sat in the chair across the work table from me. Around us, the archive smelled like paper and dust and the cedar oil I used on the older bindings. "The Council," he said, "is asking me to formalize the Northern Alliance structure before the summer summit. They want a clear statement of my governing intentions, and they want to know." He paused. "They want to know the status of the prior declaration." I set down my pen. "What status are you going to tell them?" He looked at me with the winter sky eyes and the scar on his jaw, and the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and is not asking permission for it, but who is asking something more important than permission. "I was thinking," he said, "that I would like to tell them it is no longer a procedural matter, that it is a personal one, and that the person involved has agreed to let it be a personal one." The archive was very quiet. "That is a very formal way of asking something," I said. "I am a formally trained governing authority. You grew up in the lower district." "That too." I looked at him across the work table, across the unindexed records and the new filing system and 4 months of evenings on the cliff path, and I thought about the white dress still presumably hanging from the iron hook in my old Stonehaven chamber, and about Caldervoss's dignity, and about Sarah laughing on the road down from the pass, and about the girl who had learned to carry an absence quietly and had built something real and functional from the carrying of it. That girl had become someone who walked into council chambers and spoke when the records were relevant, and stayed quiet when they weren't. Someone who had rebuilt her own architecture from the inside out, without help, and knew the value of every beam. She was not going to disappear into the story of anyone else's life. But she could. I understood this clearly, in the quiet of the archive with the cedar oil smell and the spring light coming through the narrow window. She could choose to write herself into a shared one, on her own terms, with her own name on every page. "I agree," I said. "It is a personal matter." He held my gaze. "Then I'll tell the council that," he said. "Yes," I said. "Tell them that." We were formally recognized at the summer summit, in front of representatives from all 4 territories, with a ceremony that was nothing like the one I had stood in a white dress preparing for the previous winter. It was brief and direct and entirely of our own design. Sarah stood at my left. Greta stood at Aiden's right. The council registered it without objection, which I chose to interpret as institutional acceptance, and Sarah chose to interpret as the council having learned to pick their battles. Both were probably true. I remained the head archivist of Thornwall Keep. That was not a compromise or a concession. It was a condition I had named clearly, and that had never once been questioned. Poppy and Thea became my permanent staff. The 40-year backlog was fully indexed by the end of that first year, and the resulting cross-reference system was adopted by 2 other territories within 18 months, which Sarah pointed out was probably more concrete influence on the northern reaches than most council members had achieved in decades. Aiden governed. I archived. We argued about everything and agreed about the things that mattered. On clear evenings we walked the cliff path, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't. And the silence was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Caldervoss, I learned the following spring, had entered an alliance of his own choosing. A woman from the Western Territories who had apparently found his composure and precision as reassuring as the council had always hoped someone would. I was glad for him. Genuinely. And Stonehaven Keep, when I returned for an official archival visit 2 years after I had left, smelled exactly as it always had. Pine resin and cold stone, winter flowers, the particular paper smell of the records hall. I stood in the doorway of that room, the one where I had spent 3 years building something functional from what was left, and I looked at the walls of documents and maps and the accumulated memory of a pack's long life. Then I walked in, and I did the work. And at the end of the day, I packed my notes and rode back north, toward the cliff and the archive and the keep that had become, without my quite planning it, the place where I was entirely and exactly myself. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all.